Welcome to Downtown Sports. My name is Downtown Stephen Brown, and in today's video, guys, I want to go over what seems to be the latest plans for the Toronto Maple Leafs at this year's trade deadline. On an edition of insider trading from earlier in the week, Chris Johnston had reported that the Maple Leafs prefer to acquire players with term left on their contracts as opposed to rental players at this year's trade deadline. Which, when I first read that headline, I was kind of shocked, but also very intrigued, because if the Maple Leafs are open to it, obviously they feel that it's possible. And if they feel that it's possible, well, then we may be in for a more exciting trade deadline than it's been in years past. Obviously, some things are more likely than others, and we'll talk about it in about a minute or so, what it would take for the Maple Leafs to be able to afford to acquire someone else and still re-sign the players that they need to this summer. But CJ mentioned the fact that they spent 6 draft picks at last year's trade deadline in a couple of deals for players like Nick Foligno and Riley Nash and David Rittich, and they were eliminated in the first round, and that just didn't work out. That's a lot to pay to just be one and done. And it was mentioned in that same insider trading report that a player who has term remaining on his deal that the Leafs have apparently called on, and now so have a lot of other teams, is Jakob Chychrun. And we did a video talking about if the Maple Leafs should be interested in what it would take to be able to fit him under the cap next offseason and what it would cost them in a trade to begin with about a month ago. And if you're interested in checking that video out, I will leave it linked above the screen and at the end of this one. And by the way, if you're new here and you do enjoy this video, it would mean a lot to me if you considered subscribing. And if you're already subscribed, make sure to hit the thumbs up button, because we've been absolutely killing it lately. And there's going to be a lot more content to come in the coming weeks. If we're looking at the Maple Leafs salary cap situation for next offseason, it's going to be tight, either way you put it. Even with the salary cap going up by $1 million, and even with Phil Kessel's retained $1.2 million in salary coming off the books, Morgan Rielly's raise basically eats that up. And they have about just over $7 million to re-sign UFAs like Jack Campbell, replace Jason Spezza if he decides to retire, and Ilya Mikheyev as well. And then there's restricted free agents like Rasmus Sandin and Timothy Liljegren and Pierre Engvall and Ondrej Kase. You know, the $7 million is just not going to cut it. If you were to offload a guy like Nick Ritchie and Travis Dermott, that would bump you up to around $11 million or so in cap space. And at that point, if Jack Campbell's next contract comes in at around $5 million or so, you'd have around $6 million left over to re-sign guys like Timothy Liljegren, Rasmus Sandin, Ondrej Kase, and still fill out a fourth line and maybe carry an extra skater. Is that going to be enough? Probably, but you'd definitely be stretching it. There are ways for them to go out and find good value contracts. You know, just like they found Michael Bunting, David Kampf, and Ondrej Kase this year, there's going to be similar type players available next offseason as well. And if you're worried about them losing an Ilya Mikheyev possibly, well, they got him over in Europe for nothing in the first place, right? So maybe they can dive back into that well and find another European free agent signing. Or maybe they're able to rely upon a Toronto Marley taking their next step in their development, right? Nick Robertson just resumed skating and practicing with the Marlies after suffering that broken fibula, I believe, back in October. We're going to have to see what he does for the rest of this season. Is Josh Hosang able to be a guy that makes this team next year? It was rumored that the Leafs were going to sign him a couple of weeks ago, but they pulled back on that because if they did sign him to an NHL deal, that would have made him ineligible to have played for Team Canada at this year's Olympics. And obviously, that's an opportunity that you just can't pass up, especially when nothing is guaranteed at the NHL level with the Maple Leafs. But if he goes over there and plays really well in the Olympics, I can't see any reason why they wouldn't have a contract waiting for him when he got back. So he could play for this team this year, and we could already know what we have in him for next year. So there's probably not room for Jakob Chychrun's $4.6 million a year cap hit here, even though that's an extremely valuable contract and a really good player. It's just, where do you fit that guy in? Even if you're looking at a different player, maybe a slightly cheaper player, or they're able to get salary retention on a player who's not a UFA this offseason, but the following offseason. You know, I doubt that a team's going to retain salary on a guy who's got 3 or 4 years left on his deal, unless you're the Leafs and you do it with Phil Kessel, of course. Even in that scenario, let's say you're able to get a guy who's making $5 million and the team you acquire him from retains 50%. So now a good player for $2.5 million, but you're more than likely looking at moving another player off of this roster to fit that guy in. Who's it going to be? Is it a guy like Peter Mrazek? Because with the way that he's played so far this year, I would view him as next to untradeable this offseason. And of course, he could play better in the second half of this year, which would be good because the Leafs kind of need him to. But then at that point, you're layering a hypothetical on top of another hypothetical. You could look to possibly trade a guy like Alex Kerfoot, who, yeah, he's having a career year, but he's also on a major PDO bender as well. And if you're looking to sell high on him, possibly, this is not something that you want other people knowing about. And if you're looking to trade him, I mean, PDO bender or not, I still do think he has value because the majority of the actual money that's owed to him would have been paid out, especially if this is a summer trade. So you could, but then you'd have to replace him as well. And then at this point, I don't necessarily know if the team would be better, more so than it would just be different, right? Because you have to weigh how much better they would be compared to all the assets that you would need to throw out the door to make this possible in the first place. And this is a little excerpt from an article that I wrote on the LeafsNation.com that was published this morning, but Chris Johnston said that on Insider Trading, but then he wrote a article in the Toronto Star about a couple of days later or so and shared the sentiment that, yes, adding a player with term is what the Maple Leafs would prefer to do, but as we see, that would be sort of difficult to do, so they may have to face a reality that they're more than likely just going to have to look at adding rental players at this year's trade deadline and just making peace with that. But it's not like Chris said that the Leafs weren't allowed to acquire any good rental players, because he later went on to list 10 defensemen who are all going to be UFAs at the end of this year, and the list includes Hampus Lindholm and Josh Manson and Mark Giordano, Rasmus Ristolainen, Ben Sherratt, Nick Leddy, Colin Miller, and John Klingberg. And obviously some of those guys are better than others, but all pretty decent names. Now, you may have seen Josh Manson and Hampus Lindholm on that list and think to yourself, well, the Ducks are in a playoff spot right now. Why would they consider selling those guys at the deadline? Well, yeah, they're in second place in their division, but they're also 4-5-1 in their last 10 games, and if you sort it by points percentage, it knocks them down to 4th in their division. The problem with trying to forecast what the Maple Leafs may be doing at this year's trade deadline is that we're still 7 weeks away from the trade deadline. It's not until March the 21st. And with all the canceled games that we had in December, and those games being made up in February, there's still a large percentage of the league that has more than half their games to play. So how are the Anaheim Ducks supposed to make up their mind on whether or not they're going to try to go for it or be sellers at this year's trade deadline? Or even if they're in a position to make the playoffs this year, who says they don't pull a St. Louis Blues and just trade them anyway? Now, maybe they don't trade both of those guys, but what's the point of being somewhat exciting, barely making the playoffs, getting knocked out in the first round, and then losing one or maybe even both of those guys for just absolutely nothing? But in order to acquire a rental player or a player with term, the Maple Leafs would still need to move a player off of their roster right now in order to make the money work in either of those scenarios. As Earl points out here on Twitter, the Maple Leafs have made a point to take advantage of the $0 emergency recall as much as possible over the last couple of weeks since it's been implemented, where whenever there's been an injury, they've been able to recall someone under an emergency basis for $0, and they've been able to maintain being under the salary cap by about $350,000 or so. And if they were able to maintain that pace by the trade deadline, that $350,000 would turn into about $1 million in cap space. $1 million isn't anything crazy, but if you're able to get 50% salary retention, that million turns into 2, and if you are able to involve a third-party team and get an extra 50% retained, which is what they did in the Nick Foligno trade, you can stretch that $1 million into 4 very quickly. But that could get expensive, right? The Leafs had to pay a 4th-round pick for the Sharks to be the middleman in the Nick Foligno trade, and at that point, I would rather take that mid-round pick and maybe package a B-level prospect that the Maple Leafs weren't really going to use anyway, and find a taker for Nick Ritchie, because that would be the most ideal scenario, right? You'd be able to wash your hands with that situation. Both parties get a fresh start. You don't have to worry about the second year of that contract, and you get more cap space to work with for this year, plus the amount that you'd have already banked, plus the prospect of getting some salary retention, and you'd be in a position to acquire somebody and not have to subtract from the roster that you'd already have. But if it's not possible to find a taker for Nick Ritchie because the asking price is too high, then I think you need to move on to the next thing, and that's possibly moving on from Travis Dermott. We talked about this a little bit earlier on in the video and in a previous video, but the Leafs are more than likely going to be in a position where they need to move Travis Dermott and Nick Ritchie this offseason in order to just re-sign the guys that they need to. So why not pull the trigger on one, if not both those guys now, and improve the team at this year's trade deadline in a meaningful way? At what point is this a conversation about quality over quantity? Right? I'm not saying that Travis Dermott is bad or he doesn't have a place on this team. It's just that the Maple Leafs need a defenseman who's better than him. Ideally, they need a defenseman who's better than Justin Holl to play with Jake Muzzin and help him out. Jake Muzzin and Justin Holl have made a lot of interesting decisions when playing together this year, and that's what I've been calling the miscues in these videos so far, just interesting decisions. But if we're taking a look at their numbers together overall on the season, they're not as bad as what a lot of people want to make them out to be. Now, this isn't a limited sample, but since the beginning of 2022, things are beginning to look up for both Jake Muzzin and Justin Holl as the D pairing. They're controlling the majority of the shot attempts. They're controlling the majority of the actual shots. They're winning the goal share. They're winning the expected goal share. They're controlling the majority of the scoring opportunities and the majority of the high danger shot attempt share as well. It's in a limited amount of minutes, but hey, it's a step in the right direction. How many steps is it? I don't know. It's at least a few, though. We went a little bit off topic there, but my point is that if the Maple Leafs still need Jake Muzzin and Justin Holl to be a thing for them moving forward, it can be. It's been moving in the right direction. But if they're able to acquire a defenseman who's better than Justin Holl, well, now they're able to slot a guy who's been fairly decent on a shutdown pairing for them lower in the lineup. And he's been a large component to a very effective penalty kill for them basically all season long. You know, playing against lesser competition on their third pair, he should be able to be very effective for them. And at $2 million, you know, he shoots right-handed. That's pretty much the going right for a third pair right-handed defenseman, unless you have a young guy on an entry-level deal playing there. But if we're looking at Travis Dermott, and his minutes with Rasmus Sandin, they've both been excellent when playing together. But Rasmus Sandin's been good basically with anyone playing next to him so far this year. And if we're looking at Travis Dermott in his minutes without Rasmus Sandin versus Rasmus Sandin without Travis Dermott, kind of swings in the complete opposite direction for the two players. Again, I'm not picking on the guy, but it's been a theme the last couple of years. Every time he's asked to be more than just a third pairing defenseman, he can't do it. He can't carry his own pair. He doesn't play on the penalty kill. He doesn't play on the power play. He doesn't really block shots. He doesn't throw big hits. What does he do? What's his role on this team? He's going to be 26 this upcoming December. He's not a rookie anymore. He's played almost 250 NHL games. Like we said earlier in the video, in an ideal world, it's Nick Ritchie who you would move out, because then at that point, you would have your defenseman who's better than both Justin Holl and Travis Dermott, but you'd also still have Justin Holl and Travis Dermott, and that would be some pretty good depth on the blue line to be able to take a decent run at this year's playoffs. But if you wanted to make an upgrade at the forward position, maybe you consider moving Nick Ritchie and Travis Dermott, right? If you can't do both, then you're probably only in a position to be able to afford one upgrade at this year's trade deadline, but that's okay. I like the forward group the way that it is. You know, the fourth line could use some tinkering, but other than that, it's been pretty good. There are other moves that they can make to potentially free up some cap space, like we talked about, maybe selling high on a guy like Alex Kerfoot, who's having a career season, but also on a major PDO bender. But in order of preference of guys that I would like to trade, it would be Nick Ritchie, Travis Dermott, and then Alex Kerfoot, especially when it just comes to making a trade to free up some cap space. I mean, I look at how well a guy like Kerfoot was able to play in last year's playoffs and just fill in at the center position in a pinch and have 6 points in 7 games playing next to Nylander and Galchenyuk, and I really like that flexibility. I'm not in a rush to move him. I know this video is probably really long, but that's okay. There was a lot of things to talk about it and a lot of context to add. I wanted to do it right, and hopefully I did. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to leave me a like on it if you did like it, and subscribe for more, because more is always on the way. And I do promise that eventually we will talk about actual players that we can add to this roster and not just hypothetical situations. I'm aware that it's a little bit dry. I'm aware. I understand, but it's all relevant and important.